Hello and welcome to the Piral Community Standup, third edition. I hope you can hear me. All right, so what do we have on the agenda? We start with taking a little bit of a view on the current status of the version 1 that is still out there for end of July. We'll have a look at the current progress on the documentation page, and regarding Piral plugins, we'll have a little bit of a demo for Piral containers, what it can do for you, and how developing with Piral containers as a plugin feels like. As usual, if you have any questions, just shout, write it in the chat. Otherwise, I will always, of course, ask after each bullet point. So let's just start with the version 1. So right now, what we are working on is documentation, and of course, as usual, improvements, bug fixes, etc. The thing that we are currently testing is the full text search in documentation. Regarding documentation, I will talk about in after this block in like 5 minutes. The other things we are doing is we are updating and adding some missing documentation pieces. So here, what we are after is really to have the complete picture. We will also throw out things, and we will try to consolidate here to make the documentation really not only up to date, but really easy and great to digest. We know that Piral is complex, and it touches a lot of complicated topics, and we try to make them really digestible to make you productive and just be able to maneuver the documentation quickly and know what this is all about, what is important, what is not so important. Now, the other things are a little bit of hygienic topics. So we got some awesome pull requests out there for making, for instance, the emulator of the Piral instance a little bit more flexible, for instance, regarding the endpoint where the pilets are then served for debugging, but also to support things like custom build hooks, where you could add certain scripts in your npm configuration, and then they would be run either always when your Piral instance build, or if just the emulator is built, etc. So I think these are great flexibility enhancements, and we try here to make that already quite polished for the version 1. So that's incoming. We are working here together with awesome contributors. Right, and the other things, I mean, from the previous versions that we carried over, still we try maybe to reproduce that one bug on Windows that happens for some users with using the global installation of the Piral CLI for scaffolding, which fails there due to npm not found. Still not being able to reproduce this, so if we can reproduce it, would be awesome. And I want to provide a utility package for making testing with Jest really convenient. Still trying to, let's say, scope this properly and see what should go in. If we don't find anything that is really useful, we will potentially discard that completely. So this is a story that we don't know yet if it makes it in or if it's useful at all. But what comes definitely is Piral Blazor update, but more on that, I think, in another stand-up. Right. So before we go into the documentation, any questions on the agenda that we have from the version 1? If I don't hear anything, I assume it's all good. And we can proceed to documentation page. Now, documentation page was already shown a week ago, but of course, since then and since the release of the 0.11.8, this page progressed a bit. Still not sure if it remains like this. So there are, for instance, this version, the length here is not really correct. So it should be a little bit wider here. So this is definitely not wanted. The other thing is that we potentially make the part of the header here sticky, including the search. So not sure yet how that will look like. But what, for instance, happened is that we now have this bottom bar that always allows it within a top-level section navigate to the next item, which I think is quite nice. So you can always navigate forward, backwards, and then always stay in the flow. Don't need to navigate here. You can just go on, go on, go on. And the sidebars are now quite flexible. Now for the types, for instance, it's just removed. There is no sidebar. Maybe we come up with one that just, you know, has all the available interface and let's call them symbol names in this navigation. So not sure yet if we make that. But this page with the types is anyway an area where contributions would be highly appreciated, because we don't know yet what is an ideal design here. This is the old way we did it, that you can just expand, collapse these items and then, you know, jump around here. But maybe there is a better kind of visual representation, and we would like to go for that. But for now, it's just the old version, a little bit revamped. And yeah, of course, here you can jump around between all the different kinds of packages that we have in our core framework. Otherwise, the types are, of course, distributed. So for instance, for the plugins, you always have the types there, of course, beside the plugin. Right. The other thing that improved since last time is if you navigate within one section, yeah, you see the loading spinner, but this bar didn't change. So you always stay here at the same level where you've been, which is quite nice in my opinion, because that means you don't start again at the top. You can also use this to just, you know, navigate around, and it just feels very natural. Good. The other thing to mention is on the reference, right? So we have at the moment already some new topics in there, but again, we will consolidate that. So for instance, we have a little bit about the pluggable bundlers, but again, that will potentially be a little bit made more streamlined and beautiful. And yeah, so here you can see, for instance, one of the new boxes that we introduced, which comes up with a question, and you can then immediately see, for instance, what would be the scenario if the Piral can work without a bundler. And we got other boxes there as well. I think in the guidelines, for instance, if we look at publishing pilots, I think it's not in this version, still on my local machine, but there we would, for instance, have a box that indicates that you shouldn't share, of course, the secret for the API key for your Piral feed, right? So things like that will always be remarked with these boxes. And I think it's just from the visual presentation, much cleaner than beforehand and much easier to navigate, of course. Finally, I mean, mentioning the search, I'm not sure if the latest version is out there, but if it is, then this is now, I think, in general, a little bit better. I think it is the latest version. Let's see. And therefore, it should get you much better results, for instance, but also the presentation here should be much better. And of course, this was also a problem with the former release of the documentation. The URLs are now always accurate. I think in general, the search should be on par. Again, we will still refine that until the version 1 is out there. But I think it's already in a much better state than it was, let's say, before the 0.11.8, but even now since yesterday or the day before. And then we keep improving here, and any feedback would be appreciated on this one. Right. So any question regarding the documentation?
Yeah, it looks great, the documentation. One question or one thing to think about: if we make a sticky header, Might be also a good idea to have the navigation, which is now under the bottom, also up in the header, because then you don't need to scroll always down to the bottom in order to navigate to the next section. So if you're half through, then you decide, oh, I need to go back or I need to go forward. I can always do that with a sticky header. Maybe if it fits from a styling perspective, that might be an option.
Yeah. I guess it's a possibility. We just would need to see how that looks like, right? So right now, this bar here at the bottom is also, let's say, in the let's call this mobile view, a little bit different. So there, it only goes to a single arrow here, and you mostly see the next part, right? So. But of course, if you are already on the, let's say, we are at 17 here. Let's say if you would start at the introduction, and then you just don't have a left bar. So maybe it's similar then in some sense to what we present on the mobile view. And then we would only need to clarify if we always want to show that, also make it sticky on the bottom, or if we show it then on the top header. But we would need to see, right?
Oh yeah, so maybe making it sticky on the bottom would also be an option, so that you don't need to scroll completely up and it's completely down in order to navigate.
Yeah, I think it's will be a question we need to answer with how we can use the screen canvas. Of course, the most part should be taken by the content, and if it's just a tiny bar, then maybe it's fine. Just need to see, right, what makes sense here. But it could be good. Any other questions? What I could do is I could open an issue and we could sketch, maybe like we did with the documentation design in general, sketch there how it could look like, and then get opinions in the issue. No questions. So yeah, then I would come to the next and last bullet point for this stand-up, unless, of course, anyone, of course, jumps in with additional topics, is showing one plugin, which is the Piral Containers plugin. So yeah, what I have here running is an instance of the Piral CLI of a Piral instance that I just set up. Let's have a look. All that I installed is the Piral Containers plugin in the current version. So even though I use here the latest bits of the version 1, I only use the 0.11.8 of Piral Containers. And what is added there is a new plugin, which is called Piral Containers API. And if you, let's say, are acquainted with creating a Piral instance, you know that plugins, is this something new? Well, it's actually the new name for extendAPI. So with the 0.11.8, this was the last time we had extendAPI. We will still have it in the 1.0, but it's deprecated and it actually shouldn't be used. It's plugins now, and I think that reflects more what is behind it, and I think should make the API a little bit easier to discover. So the documentation there has already been updated. Of course, in the docs Piral.io, you will still see the old one for 0.11.8. All right, so what I added here is the containers API. Quite simple, right? Import that from the Piral containers, and that's it. And then for showcasing purposes, I just get what we call the root pilet. It's just a pilet that's baked into your Piral instance already, which makes it very easy to test and showcase things, right? So I can just get this Pilet API object here, call a function, and later on, if I really want to transport this into a Pilet, I could also just, move that file and it would just work, with exception of that this is then not Piral, but your Piral instance name. But everything else would just work. Okay, so what I did is quite simple. I call API create state, and that's the API method that comes with the Piral Containers plugin. And then I need to provide two things in this object. One is what we call the state. That's the initial state. And one thing that we call the actions. And the actions are just functions that you can place in there. So let's call them methods here because they're in this object. And they have always an implicit first argument, which is what we call dispatch. And this is what you can use in a reducer-like pattern to actually modify your state that you created. So the state starts now with count 0. And for instance, in this action here that I called INC for increment, I will actually trigger a state change where I set the count to count +1, but the rest of the state remains as is. And the same is true now for the DEC, so decrement method that I implemented here. And it also just works. Now, what I get back when I call create state is a higher order component. So I can just leverage that, for instance, with state that I called it. And what I do here for a first demonstration is I just wrap a standard React component. That's this thing here, and pass it over to register tile. So what did I do? What's my component? Well, it takes two things that are actually coming from this higher order component. Takes state, takes actions. And then with that, I just render the following part. So it renders some diff that has a counter h2 and then render out the current state.count, which is exactly what you see above here. So this is that number, right? So all the typing just works. I didn't need to introduce anything. If there would be an additional state in there, I don't know, some string, then I would also know about it. So it would know that there is foo, for instance. If there is no foo, then yeah, it also knows about this, which is quite nice. And similar, of course, I can now wire up the actions. So I got these two pieces that I also defined here, just the current versions of them. And I can just wire the increment to this button and the decrement to that button. And the end result looks like this. Well, not exactly like this, but more like that. Let's refresh. Let's start with the new application. Counter 0, so plus increments minus decrements. So quite simple, and this thing always stays up to date. Yeah, even if I change pages, right? That's now, because it's a global state, it's no longer this local state that's only, valid with the lifetime of this component, but it's actually bound to the lifetime of the whole Piral instance of your whole application. So quite nice. And of course, you can reuse this higher order component. So if you say you got another thing here, another tile, for instance, and even a page, then this will also work. Let's have a look. So here we got this on two things. I incremented. This also updates. I can go into the page. It also has this. And again, just works. No problem. And the best thing is, of course, that you could now define your whole component somewhere. I don't know. You create your new page TSX. Import, of course, React. And then you export your React function here. So that would be all that you do. Let's say I still got this one here. And now, of course, you could say that my page props actually already demand such a prop that's called state, and that's the simplest case. So if you have this and you have state, you could type it. Of course, ideally you have the type somewhere already lying around. You don't duplicate it because in a refactoring you also want just a single change to trigger all the changes. But yeah, let's just be explicit here. Right, and so all I can do now here is just say, let's maybe wrap my page yeah, and then it of course complains because it doesn't like me because I don't extend the page component props, I guess. Let's see. Then it would say it's fine. Right, so, and that would just work. Let's see. Go there, counter is at 0, increment it, counter is at 4. So essentially exactly as beforehand. But ideally, of course, you would want to follow our best practice. You wouldn't have this here. And maybe you also wouldn't have the state here, would just say, oh, by the way, I'm interested in a count. So let's hand over the count to me, please. And following this, your component would look a little bit different. So you would wrap again an anonymous component, but this one would just leverage the page, and you would hand over the state count here. And then of course everything is fine again, all is great, everything is awesome, and we just save all. And then the count is at 0, go back, increase, all cool. Okay, so far to that. And of course you could go crazy here and say, let's maybe add another thing, increment by offset, or I don't know, by amount. Yeah, let's just do that. And we say we get an amount, a number in here, and essentially this is the same thing. So only difference is that you now make it with this amount. And if we want to use this, nothing prevents us from doing that. So we could, for instance, leverage it. Well, maybe let's do it here in this tile, that it also has some other meaning. We could just say, oh, let's make a button. Add 10 more. And so if we click that, we could just call the actions inc by amount, and you see again full IntelliSense. You now see it only has one argument. The first argument is always implicit, and so you would just say 10 here. And if we go back, we could now add 10 more, and it just works. So that's Piral containers. I think quite useful. Again, it already uses the global state container, and what it puts on top is a nice API that you can use in your pilets without much trouble if you want to have a global state in your pilot. And it makes it very efficient because it just shares the global state. Any questions to this? Otherwise, I would say now room for general questions. Or discussion. Because if not, then we would conclude the session. Doesn't seem so. Great. Okay, then that's it for this week. Thanks for attending. As always, if you have something to share, message us. And otherwise, see you all next week. Bye.
Bye.